Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this video I'll be addressing a very important question. Why castles? Why were they built, and what purpose did they serve? The answer to this question might seem rather obvious to some of you, but there are some significant points that you might not have considered. You see, in the videos I've been able to make about castles thus far, I have really emphasized how effective they really were, and the castles are just incredible. A small number of defenders can effectively defend a castle from a very large number of aggressors. This has been done historically many times. Now, of course, castles did fall, but it took time and it was difficult to take them. Many of my viewers understand this and have come to me with a kind of obvious question as a result. Okay, if I'm going to basically commit suicide by sending my army against this castle, why bother even attacking a castle? Why can't I just take all the land round about and ignore it? Well, I'll get to answering that question, but first I want to address why castles? Why were they initially built? And in so doing, I'll probably answer this other question as well. Castles are essentially a military base, but there's obviously a distinct difference between a castle and a military base just by the fact that we have different terms for them. And the difference is that on top of being a military base, a castle is also a place of governing, okay? It's a center of government, and it is also a personal residence. Another point of distinction, which is common to most castles, but some castles actually don't have this, distinction, is that a castle is generally smaller than a full-blown military base. Like if you have a look at the Roman fortifications where their standing armies would, rest, resupply, and train, they were pretty darn big. The average castle was nowhere near as big as that, and the reason for this is explained by the medieval government. The standard medieval government was a feudal society. It was a fractured government. There was no massive overarching state. Now, you might think, well, what about the king? Well, the kings of the medieval period were actually not as powerful as the great ancient rulers of Rome and the other massive empires. Speaking more about the early and high medieval periods, of course, in the late medieval periods, medieval kingdoms got far larger and became far more powerful. But still, even in these early medieval kingdoms, they could field pretty impressively sized armies, but it wasn't in the same way that the older empires did. There was no national requirement for military service or state-run training camps. Instead, local leaders were expected to recruit, equip, and train a certain number of soldiers independently. And this was because power was not as centralized. The individual kings did not have the resources to field huge armies by themselves, nor did they have the resources to control and govern such large land areas. They weren't able to establish large military bases with large, groups of men and barracks and stuff in even locations throughout all the land that they claimed. And the perfect example of this, and really the one that kind of set it off, was William the Conqueror. You see, William and his Normans came in and conquered England, but the size of the conquering force was much smaller than the population that they had just conquered. So then, how are they going to keep this rebellious population in check? Well, William granted different areas of land to certain loyal servants, basically saying, you are going to rule this smaller portion of land in my name, but I'm going to give you a certain level of autonomy. You just have to keep this populace in check, tax them properly so I get the wealth that I rightly deserve and you'll get a portion of it too. It was a pretty good deal. But still, how is this loyal servant to William going to keep a population in check that's essentially larger than the force that he has? The answer is fortifications. Not the massive, huge fortifications of years past, but smaller fortifications, and I might as well make it where I live because I want to protect myself. These people probably don't like me. We've just conquered them and they might want to kill me, so I might as well make my home fairly protected. And there's no point in doubling up the effort in making a separate fortification for my men. I'll let them live under the same roof. Or, in fact, I might make separate kind of, rooms or houses for these soldiers, a barracks, but keep it in this inside the same wall. Now remember what castles do, they enable a smaller force to be able to fight off a much larger force. So if any of these, populations that are rebellious, if they want to rebel and kick out these usurpers, well, they're going to have a much harder time of it now because they have to take on these significant fortifications. Could they make fortifications of their own? Well, they don't really have the resources, and if they tried, because there is already a force in the local area that has the weapons and armaments, well, the leaders can just come in and slaughter anyone as they're trying to build any rebellious fortifications. You see, this is how castles were initially used offensively, and you could kind of call it the genesis of the medieval castle. They were the Motte and Bailey style castles. We see images of them depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, and so castles came about due to the fractured state of medieval style government. It really is an ingenious strategy when you think about it. Castles, of course, evolved from this time. As the medieval government grew in power, so did the sizes of castles, because outside of keeping a dispersed but large population in check with smaller forces and resources, they are profoundly effective in warfare and fighting off any invaders. This is pretty much for the same reasons as to why they're so effective in controlling a population, because fortifications enable the defending force or whoever is in these fortifications to be able to fight off a much larger force. Now, if the defenders have an equal size force as opposed to the attackers, well, adding fortifications on top of that almost guarantees the defenders' victory, and the attackers are going to have to resort to some different and even creative strategies to try and get these defenders outside of their fortifications. One strategy is, of course, sacking the land round about and going scorched earth, but there's a problem with that. It's temporary. It does not achieve what the invaders want, which is to take the territory. And you can't take the territory unless you deal with the defenders in that land. Outside of just full-blown battle where it was army against army, warfare was also conducted very much through skirmishes and maneuvers. Skirmishes can be very effective, and the primary purpose would be to inflict losses on an enemy, whether that's in killing certain number of their soldiers or cutting off supply lines. You can win wars through skirmishes. Sending out a raiding party that just comes in, impact warfare, hits the enemy, and then runs off. The issue is the running off. You need to have a place of safety to get away from the enemy who would want to, respond to getting attacked. If you have fortifications nearby, you have a secure place to retreat to. An aggressor, someone who is trying to invade a land, won't have that advantage unless they, are able to build them, but that takes time. Therefore, a really good tactic for a defender is to keep their armies behind in their fortifications and just harry the enemy, nip at their heels constantly with these skirmishes. But of course, that can only be done for so long, because if the enemy is going total scorched earth on all the land, that can create significant problems. It is still a temporary measure. Just raiding the land nearby does not conquer that land. And another problem with just going on a raiding spree is that it's not dealing with the defenders. The defending army is still there, and a big issue with just sacking the land round about is that it gives the defenders time to raise more troops. Time is a profoundly significant resource in warfare, especially if winter is approaching. You don't want to wage a war in winter, so you only have so much time to raid, and this is exactly what happened before the Battle of Agincourt. King Henry V did not want to fight the French. The French had a huge army, and he did not expect to win. In general terms, you would not think such a smaller force would be able to defeat such a larger one as what happened in the Battle of Agincourt. This is why Henry was trying to run away. Why was he trying to run away? Well, he made some crucial mistakes. When he besieged the port city of Harfleur in his initial assault, it took too long, nearly a whole month, to take that city. Now, the French could have tried to relieve that siege, but they chose to raise a larger force which would guarantee them victory. And in normal circumstances, it would have. You can generally be confident of victory if you have a larger force, not always, warfare can be a very risky thing in many circumstances. But Henry ran out of that valuable resource, time. The campaign season was almost over, so he didn't have time to take any more territory, so he went on a raiding spree. But the longer he took to do this raid, the more time he gave the French to assemble a larger force. So large, in fact, that he realized he made a mistake and he decided to just leg it and try and get out of there, but it was too late and the French were able to surround him. Normally, that would have spelled his defeat. It was just the unique circumstances of the battle itself, the Battle of Agincourt, which gave the English victory. And so just choosing to go on a massive raid through the land is not always the best choice, because it gives the defenders time. Time is a very valuable resource, and one of the ways the defenders will use that resource is to rally a larger force to kick out these aggressors. So that is why raiding and ignoring the defenders in their fortifications and castles and cities isn't a good idea. It does not take territory, which is the whole purpose of an invasion, and it doesn't deal with the defending army. Therefore, aside from giving protection, security, and a means to repel attackers, castles and also medieval style fortifications such as on cities grants this very significant resource: time. Conquering a city with fortification takes a lot more time than a city with none. And even then, conquering that city or castle is not a guarantee. An attacker could destroy his entire army on the walls of these defenses. Which is why the most common way they tried to take castles and cities was by starving them out. So instead of assaulting the walls, they would just surround them and play the waiting game. But again, playing the waiting game gives the defenders that resource: time. Warfare like this is very sophisticated, and choosing to do what and when can spell victory and defeat. If you know that there is no large forces nearby, you might be able to take your time and take a castle by starving it out. But if there is a larger force nearby, you probably don't have time to starve them out, so that requires far more aggressive tactics, which is also a risk because you're going to lose men in doing so. Fortified castles and cities really were the linchpins of medieval territory. If you wanted to take that territory, you needed to take the fortified locations. This is where the defending armies will be located, and it is where you will be able to station your own troops to grant yourself security and defense while you control this newly conquered territory. You just can't move in troops into a land and say, "This land is mine," and be so vulnerable. You need a more permanent place for defense, resupply, and just residence. Once your troops and army are able to live in this newly conquered territory in a secure enough way that it's not likely that your, soldiers will just be killed in an attack, you can pretty much say you own the adjacent land. These are the reasons why castles were built in the medieval period, what purpose they served, and the advantages they offered. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you again, and until that time, farewell.